This was a story told to me by my father, who has lived in New Hampshire his entire life. He is 48 years old. He's a well-known fireman and knows a lot of people, and knows New Hampshire fairly well. This story he told me reminded me of one of the stories on one of your recent videos, about some big creature spotted by a group of campers in northern New Hampshire. So, my dad grew up in northern New Hampshire in small towns. One thing people know about those areas is that it is haunted. I guess it's a popular spot for people to go to for adventures and stuff as well, to see if they can get any paranormal activity. When my dad was in high school, so about 30 years ago, he was dating this girl that was into adventurous things, and was down for doing just about anything. My dad was never fearful of anything, but this story really seemed to get to him. So, anyways, him and his girlfriend at the time decided that a cool date idea would be to go to the Mika mines and explore and see if they could experience anything. On the way there, they took a wrong turn down a long dirt road. This dirt road led to an abandoned sawmill. The sawmill had been abandoned for quite some time, and was known for paranormal activity, and also known for cults to go there and sacrifice animals and worship the devil. Knowing this, my dad didn't want to stick around, not because of the paranormal aspect, but he didn't want to be the next cult sacrifice. As he went to do a 3-point turn and leave, the front doors to the sawmill swung open and slammed, and out walked an 8-foot-tall creature. He described it as alien-like, swaying its huge, red glowing eyes and big black body. He swung his truck around and sped off, still able to see the creature in his rearview mirror. Luckily, he was able to get out of there, but he had no clue what this creature was, and claimed he has never felt that scared before, not even running into burning buildings. He never told many people about it, as he didn't want to be considered crazy, and where he knew everyone in that small town he grew up in, he didn't want to ruin his reputation or his family's reputation. The few people he has told have never seen or heard anything like that creature. No one knows if it was a demon, an alien, or undiscovered creature, or what it was. I know New Hampshire has a lot of forested areas and abandoned older places, so who knows what could be out there. Back when I was in the Boy Scouts, we took a trip to the Pine Barrens. I was around 11 or 12 years old. I always remember these kinds of trips to be memorable, with all of the hiking and fishing we would do. My troop and I finished setting up the side around dusk when we started making food for all of us. When it started to get late, everyone gathered around the campfire talking. I decided to take a walk to the latrine. It was about a quarter-mile away from the site, illuminated by a light post. I went inside and did my business. I knew it wasn't too far from the site and the scouts to feel any sense of being alone, but I just felt like something was off. As I was about to finish my business, I heard something outside the door. It sounded like something walking on the gravel trail. I decided to be a bit brave and look outside. What I saw is burned into my mind for life. It was a creature, hunched over, sniffing at the ground. It looked like a deer on 2 legs, but this was different. It had a forked tail, it had large bat wings, and its head was like a horse, but with horns. More like antlers. It had hooves and claws too. Its eyes were glowing red, unnatural for anything I've ever seen. I sat there looking at it for no more than 30 seconds before it stopped and stared directly at me. I immediately closed the door. Now, it was nighttime, but I knew what I saw, and it was standing underneath the lamppost. I was far too young to drink or do drugs, and the skies were clear. I kept thinking to myself that if I stay in there, it may leave. Then I heard it walking. The sound of its hooves coming closer to the latrine grew louder. I tried peeking out the small hole in the wood, but I noticed a shadow covering it. I sat frozen. I started scratching at the wooden door. My heart was beating out of my chest. I could literally hear it breathing. Then I heard a sound that I will never forget. A blood-curdling scream ripped through the air. It sounded like a bat but louder, or a woman screaming but more distorted. I felt tears running down my face. The sound of its hooves on the gravel started stomping away. I looked out the door one more time and saw it open its wings in a full sprint and leap into the air. It disappeared into the night. I waited about 5 minutes before I ran back to the site. Everyone was wondering what that sound was, and they started laughing, thinking it was me trying to scare them. I couldn't even think to sleep. I stayed in my tent holding my pocket knife in my hand. I heard the scouts outside telling stories by the fire. Then I heard them tell a story about a creature with wings, a horse head, hoofs, and red eyes. As I ran out of my tent and told them that's what I saw, that's what made them scream. They all looked at me like I was crazy. I started crying and telling them it was true. All their faces turned white, and they started freaking out. The scoutmaster told everyone to pack up when we were leaving. I found out that creature was called the Jersey Devil. After seeing it with my own eyes, before knowing the legend, I can tell you it's real. I will never enter the Pine Barrens of New Jersey ever again. This story happened about 4 months ago, and I swear, I'm still completely freaked out. I don't expect you to believe my story, because I can't even believe what I saw for myself. Sometimes, I secretly still hope that what I saw was just a loose branch or some shadow, but I highly doubt it. I'm a 14-year-old male, and every year I go skiing with my family somewhere in the mountains. Usually, we stay for about a week with our camper on a campsite. The campsite is only a few minutes away from the gondola that we use to ride up to the top of the mountain. I know the area very well. We have been skiing there since 2013, so for about 5 years now, and I have never experienced anything like this. Every year, there is a big party and concert, and a mountain at the top of the gondolas. The party falls on the week where we always visit. This is very important for the story. The party is always in the evening, and on this day, you can go skiing until midnight. Usually the slopes close at 7 in the evening. My brother, sister, and I always love this night, because skiing in complete darkness is totally epic. So, like every year, we grabbed our skis and snowboards and headed up to the gondola station at around 9 o'clock, 2 hours before the concert started, so that we still had time to go night skiing. I had a snowboard accident only a few days before, so I couldn't snowboard for long periods of time without my knees hurting like crazy. So, my parents, siblings, and I headed up to the station with the gondola. It's already dark outside, but still light enough to see something. I remember rubbing my knee and hoping that I could enjoy the night without too much pain. Up by the station, many people were already gathered, around 200 to 300 people, and some bands were already playing on the big stage. My siblings and I started to head down the slope. I was on my snowboard and my brother and sister on their skis. My parents were listening to the bands while drinking some beer. They didn't plan to go skiing that night. We were skiing for about 1.5 hours, and more people gathered by the stage. My siblings and I took the lift up one last time to be there for the beginning of the concert. About half an hour after the beginning of the concert, I noticed that my knee was hurting a lot. I was tired and stuff, and I was also freezing. My parents offered to take me to the gondola and to go to the campsite to get a good night rest. I agreed. My parents and siblings stayed up on the mountain because the concert was still a few hours long and it had just started. So I grabbed my board and stepped onto the gondola that would take me back to the valley. The trip down to the valley with the gondola took about 20 minutes. There were not many people in the gondolas around me because most people were still up there enjoying the concerts. I got out my phone and started playing some random stupid game. After about 15 minutes on the gondola, I heard a loud thud from the gondola behind me. I looked up from my phone and was completely confused because I was sure that nobody had gotten on the gondola behind me. I turned around and squinted into the darkness. I could see the gondolas behind me, but not very clearly. I had no idea where the thud had come from, or what it was, until I looked at the bottom of the gondola. There was a creature hanging on the bottom of it. I could only see the outlines of it, so I wasn't sure if it was an animal or a person or something else. I stood on the top of the bench in the small gondola and opened the small window on the side of the doors to get a better look. I turned on my phone flashlight. What I saw then almost made me drop my phone out of the gondola. At first glance, I thought it was a coyote, but at second glance, I noticed that it definitely was no coyote. The creature was about as big as a Dane, and was covered in black-gray fur with patches of fur missing. Its face was completely weird. The snout was way too long for a normal coyote, and the teeth were sticking out, both upper and lower jaws. The eyes were yellow-reddish. The creature was holding onto the gondola with its long, skinny arms. It had long, looking claws. I stumbled back and pressed myself against the glass window. I looked down hoping that I would be in the valley soon, but I had about 5 minutes left. I could already see the station. I kept my eyes glued to the creature behind me on the other gondola. I stared right back at me and grinned. Not a kind of dog grin that you know if it's panting or sometimes looks like they're smiling. But no, it was a full-on grin, wide-mouthed and showing its teeth. Then, it started to rock back and forth, still holding on to the gondola. The entire thing started to rock, and so did mine, and the one in front of mine and behind me. All because this thing was swinging. They were all attached to one long steel rope. I started to get scared. I tried to calm my breathing down to get rid of my anxiety attack. The creature flung itself forward to my gondola. It tried to grab the bottom of my gondola. I was completely shocked when it jumped because the gondolas are about 20 feet apart from each other. I heard a large clang as the creature held on to the bottom of my gondola. The valley was only a few minutes away, and I completely freaked out and started crying. I heard a loud, pitched scream from under my gondola, and I hovered in a ball on the bench. About a minute away from the valley, I heard the creature let go and drop to the ground, which was about 50 feet away, with a loud thump. I peered down and saw it sprinting away into the woods below. After I got off the gondola, I could barely walk or speak. After I made it to the camper, I locked all the doors and windows, curled up in a ball, and cried. I didn't go skiing the next day, and didn't tell anyone what I saw because I knew they wouldn't believe me. I live in eastern Pennsylvania. My friend and I were hunting coyote at night, at about 2 a.m. We were going up an unfamiliar logging trail. We had reached a clearing and eventually ran across a log that lay across the road. We stood around for a moment talking when we started hearing a sound. He said it sounded like sticks breaking. I think it sounded like someone hitting a dull axe against a log. The sound was, by my estimate, 150 yards away. I, being the more experienced one, said it was just the wind, but it was extremely irregular, like one knock every 30 to 45 seconds. It wasn't coinciding with the gust of winds, and it had changed location a bit, but remained in the same area. We also heard the noise a few times off to the side in the trees, and it sounded like it was approaching us, as if two separate things were making the noises. We felt uneasy and began to leave, That is when the sounds all stopped. After that, we left in my car. He pointed out that the woods became deathly silent while the noise was being made, and I pointed out that it stopped once we left. I remember people saying Bigfoot would break sticks to communicate or warn people. I looked up the noise and it's called tree knocking. It perfectly fit the description of what happened to me. Being a skeptic, I would like to know if anything else may have been making that noise. And did anyone else have any similar experiences? And do you think that I ran across a cryptid? I live on the west coast of British Columbia, in Canada, about midway up the coast. I was driving my girlfriend back to her granddad's house, 2 towns over from mine, about a 2.5-hour drive on the highways. I had driven her home and spent the day visiting her family. This town she is from is right on the coast. It's a port city. Not super important, but the point is that I spent the day there and was now getting ready to drive back home. About 25 to 30 minutes into the drive, I'm on the highway that runs parallel to the mouth of the river in one side and the CN tracks on the other. So it goes rail on my left and then the road I'm on and then some sort of mini channel where the river ends. I'm driving, it's getting dark, but I'm not tired or drowsy at all. There are a few rest areas along the road on my right, on the riverbank. I need to piss, so I start slowing down at the first one, and something scurries across the road. And that's almost all that happened. It was 4-legged, at least from what I saw. Black, like black as night, like unnaturally dark. No texture or anything to it, almost like a void of light or color in the shape of this thing. It ran out of the bush, over the rails. I was going slow enough that wind and highway noise was gone, and I heard it. Out of the brush came this sound, like metal tapping. It seemed like it was running over the rail. Then the sound if you took a rod or rebar and stabbed it into the ground. Then metal again, as it ran in front of me, across the road. Its body shape was like how people describe a UFO, almost a flat disc shape, like an oval stretched out, with its legs protruding from the front and back. It had no features, no eyes, no face or mouth, that I could see anyway. It ran across the road, limbs stretching out as it ran. Then, it ran into the rest area, over the bank, and I'm guessing into the river. I kept driving. I didn't piss until I got home 2 hours later. I lived alone, and in this remote location that we don't have cable or anything, so the only option is satellite TV. It was a humid summer night in July, and the TV was acting up, so I needed to go out and readjust the satellite like usual. I took a flashlight out and a gun with me. When I went outside, it was unusually quiet, like so silent it was unnerving. I brushed the thought off and went to the dish, which was in the corner of my yard. I went to work, making sure all the wires were all right and pointing it into a different angle. Suddenly, I heard a small snap of a stick to my left and turned my flashlight to the direction, and I saw a creature standing there. I got a good look at it for what seemed like an eternity, but it was probably only about 10 seconds. I slowed and backed off and ran back to my house and locked all the doors and windows. The creature was unlike anything I had ever seen before. When I shined the light at it, the first thing I saw was the head. It has cropped ears that pointed upwards. Its snout was narrower than a bear's and longer than I could imagine on a canine. I could make out large teeth protruding from the jaw. Its eyes were a deep red shade that seemed to reflect off the light as I was pointing at it. The body was muscular and huge. It had long arms and appeared to be longer than its legs. broad shoulders that tapered into a skinnier waist. It was slightly crouched over when I saw it, with one hand wrapped around a small tree. I could make out the legs, which were similar to a dog's. It had an obvious hocks, and even with the crouched position I could tell that its height was probably 6 feet or more. Standing up to full height, this creature could easily be 7.5 feet tall. The fur was black and thicker around the neck and chest, and the bottom half significantly less so, almost like it was balding. I don't know if it was aggressive or not. What I do know is that feeling of dread unlike I have ever experienced before. Was it just observing me or stalking me? For a creature this large, it was deceivingly silent. It got within 15 yards of me without ever noticing. I'm Aboriginal, and we have our own name for what Americans call skinwalkers. I am from the Central Australian desert. Cryptids are skinwalkers in the Native American folklore, and they are eerily similar to Aboriginal folklore. My great Nan used to tell me stories. One was when she gone picking berries and looking for witchetty grubs, honey ants, and bush bananas with her sister back when she was younger. One had followed them to where they were camping. During the evening, as the sun was going down, they heard something crying. It sounded near. When hearing sounds, it has the opposite effect. If it was near, it would sound far away, but if it were far away, it was definitely right there. They, my great Nan and her sister, stayed where they were and acted as if they were asleep, alert but paying no attention to it. The dogs they took with them were barking but didn't move. It was on the outskirts of their camp, just out of the light of the fire, crying. It was there. By the faraway cries, it was near, and was trying to lure them away from the light. She had told her sister to not look at it or try to speak to it. It sounded like a child crying. She said it didn't move away until the sun had started coming up. Guess it got bored. As soon as the sun was up, they made it home as fast as they could. This story always stuck with me. In my culture, whistling at night can draw them. Talking about them by word of mouth also draws them. Thankfully, I've never seen one, but I do believe they're out there. I've always known the Cryptid as an evil spirit. It could very well differ between tribes, even tribes so close together. It could even be derived from the Gadachi man. But, looking back on the stories told to me, the latter is also described as the Featherfoot Man. This happened 2 years ago. I was in England with my Boy Scout troop for a weekend in February. Everything was normal, until the second day when it had started to snow really heavily, so me and my two friends, let's call them Matthew and Lewis, decided to go and play hide and seek in the snow. I got all my warm clothes on and snuck out, which wasn't that hard because there was a window in our room. When I got out, they decided that I should be on, so I gave them 3 minutes to hide. After that, I ran in vaguely the same direction that I heard them go in. After about 4 minutes of looking, I was about to give up when I heard a weird mumbling noise. I ran over and shouted at the top of my lungs, "Found you!" But, to my surprise, instead of finding a boy wrapped in winter clothes, I found a small, white humanoid crouched over next to a carcass of what looked like a large dog. I quickly jumped up and ran away. I could hear it right behind me, jumping from boulder to boulder. Eventually, I could see the hut we were staying in. Then, I did something I wished I hadn't. I turned around. I saw this thing stand up, and realized that what I had originally thought to have been small was about the same height as me. I could see its big yellow fangs dripping with warm blood, and its eyes were deep red, and behind the door opened it was my leader. I turned around, and he was mad,
and asked me where I'd been for so long, and it turned out that I'd been gone for about a half an hour. I went through with them exactly what had happened, and as expected, no one believed me. The rest of the trip was normal, but 3 months later, I was shocked to find out that the exact same place I had been closed by police after a 12-year-old child had went missing for 2 days and had been found on a river, totally mutilated. Apparently, his throat had been ripped open, and his intestines had almost been eaten along with half of his leg. All I can say is I am never going back to that place again.
This happened when I was around the age of 7. I wasn't alone when I saw it. I'll just call them Kat, Riley, and my sister Lily. It was years ago, so my memory may be a little hazy, but I still remember a lot from that day. Riley was our next door neighbor, and Kat lived up the street. Remember, we live in Montana in a countryside and have seen many spiders like the barn spider and hairy brown spider. The 4 of us were playing that very day, but then we went into the house that me and my sister lived in at the time. I don't remember exactly why, but we went outside for a little bit. My mom was speaking to someone, and we were heading for the door. We opened the door, then one of us closed the door. Only a few seconds after, we then realized the spider was not in our view, but then we all stood there in fear. It wasn't a normal spider. Its body must have been almost the size of a baby, while its legs were much longer. It quickly went away out of sight. Then my mom, only half a minute later, or some seconds later, said she saw the big spider crawl from the back door. I think, even up to this day, that it was literally on the door. But I'm just glad none of us got bitten by that son of a bitch. It was massive. I'm not sure exactly what to think of it. Just to clarify, this didn't happen to me. It happened to my girlfriend a year or 2 ago. Nevertheless, I always get freaked out whenever I'm in her woods. There's been 2 incidents, so I'll try to make them quick. One night, she had a few of her friends over, laughing, drinking, and having a good time in general. They did all their little parties in her dad's garage, which was a few yards away from the house. Beyond the garage was an unkept path that led into the woods behind her house. Across from the garage was an old trampoline that was too ripped up to be able to jump on. They decided to head back in when it got dark. My girlfriend has a big black dog. I'm not sure of the breed, but they definitely knew she was inside at the time. Right before entering the house, my girlfriend looked at the trampoline and saw a pair of bright yellow, shining eyes. Almost cat-like. She called her friends over, and they saw it too. Her dog, Jasmine, was right behind them in the house. When Jasmine let out a bark, the thing took off at an inhuman speed. The morning after, they found long claw marks on the side of the garage. The second time was when my girlfriend was taking a walk on a small trail through the woods. She has schizophrenia, so she does hallucinate a lot, but she swears that she knew that what she saw was real. About halfway down the trail, through dense shrubbery, she saw a grayish thing. It was walking on all 4s. Its limbs looked twisted, and like it wasn't assembled right, but it definitely looked human to her. She waited for whatever it was to pass before running back home. We never go out to her woods alone anymore, especially at night or without a weapon. She believes her woods belong to wendigos or maybe skinwalkers. She couldn't tell very well. One thing is for certain, something strange is living in her forest. My mom grew up near northern Wisconsin, and she told me some of her old stories a while back, which happened to her, her brothers, and their area. And some of them I feel are worth mentioning. I've had my own paranormal experiences, which I feel are quite difficult to talk about. And I've talked about a few of them in the past. Maybe I'll share some more. For some backstory on my family, my mom grew up rather poor on a junkyard in the country in northern Wisconsin. For anyone who isn't familiar with Wisconsin, this is the part of Wisconsin that tends to have long stretches of forest and a lot of beautiful nature and scenic views. One of the stories my mom told me was something that happened to a family that apparently lived nearby. There was a family driving through the forest, and eventually their car broke down. This would have been in the 70s or 80s, before cell phones were widespread, so they ended up going out of their vehicle and making the journey home on foot. Eventually, however, they started to notice sounds from behind them, as if something was following them through the woods, or perhaps more aptly put, stalking them through the woods. When they ran, it ran. When they stopped, it stopped. Eventually, they were able to get to their house. However, when they quickly entered, slammed the door and locked it, whatever was following them gave them a bellowing scream. Apparently the family had alerted my grandfather as to what happened, and he told them to look in his fields. According to my mom, he had apparently came back into the house wide-eyed and alarmed, but he didn't elaborate on what he saw. I vaguely recall my mom talking about seeing some sort of glow in the field though. I'm unsure if it's related, but my oldest uncle went horseback riding with a friend, and they apparently came across a thing. Apparently it was white, and when they saw it, it ran off. It stood up on its hind legs, bounced on a fence, and was gone. Apparently, it left behind some fur, which my uncle apparently collected. But this would have been many, many years ago, and my uncle died when I was about 4 years old in a bad accident, so I'm unable to ask him about the story. I'm unsure if both of these stories are related or not, and there could be some natural causes to this. Black bears, wolves, dogs, etc. all could be and would be living in the area. However, judging by the tone of the story, and the fact that such animals are rather commonplace and it was apparently during the day, I'm not sure if it would be mistaken identity or not. What does interest me though, is the stories of the Wendigo, which I have heard some depictions being somewhat furry from Canada. Skinwalkers and the Wisconsin's Michigan Dogman could maybe be related, I don't know. If it was not a case of mistaken identity, I don't really care to find out either. Just be careful in the woods. Mother Nature can be a cruel mistress, and there is darkness in this world, be it supernatural or the very, very real depths of human depravity and cruelty. Protect yourself and your loved ones.
I work as a paramedic in Louisiana. Needless to say, after being in this profession for a while, you'll see your fair share of creepy things. However, nothing I've experienced could top this. The unit that I work on is quite rural compared to most others in our fleet. It was a busy night, so we were posted at a halfway point between our station and another in town to cover both parts of the area. We liked to post off the road about a quarter of a mile into the woods so we would not be bothered while we were there. It was late, so my partner and I got to the back of our unit because there is much more room to stretch out and relax in the back. My partner was asleep, and I was messing around on my phone. I felt something bump into the side of our unit, shaking the whole truck. Now, our trucks are heavy, and it would take a substantial amount of force to shake it like I had felt. I woke my partner and told him, but he brushed it off, thinking I may have been dreaming or something. Then it happened again. He immediately shot up and looked out the window, and I did the same. We couldn't see a thing outside, and it was too dark. We made the decision to cut on the unit floodlights, which illuminate the entire area around the truck. I moved from the window to hit the button, and my partner stayed behind looking out the window. As soon as I turned them on, my partner gasped and jumped back from the window. I could see it as well. The light from the back of that unit illuminated an approximately 7-foot tall creature. It looked like it was turned around, but I could not make out a face. Most of it was hairless, but I did see some matted patches of hair here and there on its body. It had extremely long, skinny arms that appeared to drag the ground behind it. The parts of the body that were hairless appeared to be gray and wrinkly. It wasn't moving, just standing there with its back towards us. We decided to radio dispatch and told them to get a police unit to our location as there was a large animal outside of our unit. About 5 minutes later, we saw the lights from the police unit come from down the road. The creature looked in the direction of the lights, turned its body, and very calmly walked into the woods. The officer walked up to our unit and opened the door. We explained to him what was going on. He said that he didn't see anything as he was pulling up, and whatever it was gone now. It's been a few months since seeing this creature, and I've never seen or heard anything like it, and I have not seen it since. Granted, we don't park in that area anymore. Needless to say, we have stayed in the front of the truck now when posting, ready to floor it and drive away if anything like that happens again.
Here in Canada, I have in-laws way up north in a place called the Northwest Territories. They're native and have a lot of weird tales from their community. They have family spread all over the north, a lot of them whom are in Alberta as well, and will play into this story. So, it was a typical winter night, maybe 10-ish years ago at my in-laws' grandparents' house. Not that late or anything, but very dark due to that time of year, and it was way too cold to be outside. At least negative 45 Celsius, or negative 49 degrees. Everyone was just hanging out and watching TV. Kids were playing, and a typical average kind of night, you know? Suddenly, there is knocking at the door. Hard, persistent knocking. This was immediately strange, as they live away, outside of any town, with kilometers between neighbors, and unannounced guests are almost unheard of. Their grandparents are visibly concerned and tell them not to answer the door. The knocking became harder, and the guests began to speak, loudly stating that they were Auntie so-and-so, and that they had been invited over. The kids wanted to answer the door to see their auntie. Apparently, it sounded exactly like her. So their grandpa had to block the kids from going near the door and tell them to get away from the door and the windows as well. The knocking became into pounding, and the guest started yelling and screaming angrily to be let in. Eventually, it stopped and the guest was gone. The next morning, there were no tracks outside in the snow, and no signs of a vehicle had been in the area. This auntie lived in Alberta and had made no plans to visit. Anyway, that's about it. Not much for excitement, but that kind of shit is weirdly common out here in some places. Believe it or not, Wendigo is a major piece of folklore in that family as well, and they refuse to talk about it out of fear of drawing one in. I grew up in Flagstaff, Arizona. Many times when you would ask natives about skinwalkers, they would get upset and would mostly refuse to even mention the word. My aunt went to a basketball game with the team my uncle was training. She stepped in since he was out sick. The game was on a reservation, and they were on a dirt road heading home around 8 at night, and she said an old woman started floating next to the van, and everyone started to scream. She told everyone in the car to pray, and she said that's when the old woman floated off into the dark. Nobody stopped praying until they got to the meeting lot where she dropped off the kids. Another story was from my friend Raiden. He told me that they were at his grandma's house watching TV at night when he heard knocking on the door. He went to go answer it and his grandparents yelled at him not to, saying that nobody comes out this late except for skinwalkers. He said after that, they heard knocking on the walls and windows, and the windows had boards that you could shut from the inside, so he never saw anything. He said the next day, he heard the walker get on top of their trailer outside and start thumping on it. Next day they came out, the roof was dented to hell. My friend Anthony told me a story of how him and his brothers were outside with their uncle, and they saw a skinwalker with blood-red eyes and pale white skin, but the face looked like a pig's. They said they sat there frozen. And they said that their uncle also froze in a spot after making direct eye contact with the walker, and the walker started walking towards them, and they said that they grabbed their uncle and dragged him inside and locked everything and called the cops. Some pretty terrifying shit. I wouldn't go searching for any of these things. It was around 11 p.m. at night. We wanted to visit a graveyard, so we ended up going to Double Butte Cemetery near South Mountain in Phoenix. As we were pulling in, a coyote dashed across the car and ran toward the mountains. It looked weird, like one of those overbred, incest German shepherds that are all short and hunched over. But I didn't think too much of it. We parked and walked away from the car and explored the graveyard. There were no sign of people or coyotes, but whenever we walked near a bush or a tree, we heard rustling. But we figured it was just some sort of rodent or bat. When we were done, we walked toward the car to leave, but we saw a cool little gated sanctuary garden type thing. So we went in there and sat for a little. All of a sudden, we heard what sounded like a weird mix of a laugh, scream, and a howl. I was confused to what this humanist scream was at first, so my mind immediately translated it to multiple coyotes, a pack. We were about to leave, and then we saw 4 sets of glowing eyes, crouching and coming toward us. Fast. I still figured an angry coyote pack, so we ran to the car. After being safe in the car, we got a little more ballsy and tried to find them. They were nowhere to be seen. I saw 3, maybe 4 shadows of human figures on the other side of the graveyard from the car. I thought to myself, wow, there are people here this late? I wonder why we didn't see or hear them. It's a pretty small, flat and treeless graveyard. Basically, just dirt and desert. So I'm pretty positive we would have known if there were others. Their shadows disappear for a while, but I'm still looking toward that direction. That's when I saw the weirdest figure, hunched over, walking in the most awkward way. The way its body moved was swift and unnatural. It was the same direction where I saw the people. We drove over to that direction and found nothing and left. We get home and we noticed the car is scratched up everywhere, like a coyote was going crazy on top of the car. The scratches were long and dragged, in different directions, and a few dirt paw prints all over the car. We had a car wash the next day, and the car was completely untouched before, and I'm pretty sure of that. We also left a McFlurry in the trunk of the car, which was untouched and not moved. If coyotes got on the car, it definitely would have been destroyed, considered how dramatic the scratches were. So yeah, I'm wondering if what we saw were skinwalkers. The graveyard is also near a reservation, and it seemed like a lot of Arizona pioneers and natives were buried there. Back about 10 years or so ago, my good friend and I would occasionally take trips to her family's property out in the middle of nowhere. It was fairly remote. You'd had to drive up a dirt road a few miles, and couldn't access it unless you had a key to the chain on the gate. There wasn't anyone around for miles. All that was there was a trailer they had towed up and left to sleep in. The feel out there was always a little off. One day, we were wandering around the property, not really thinking of much until about 20 minutes later when we realized we had actually been walking out into the middle of nowhere. We had no water with us and had no clue where we were. Luckily, we found our way back after a while, but neither of us could explain why we did that. I'd also take my voice recorder, and we caught quite a few strange things on it. One day, before heading out there, we were talking about Skinwalker Ranch. It was only about a 40-minute drive from the property, so we thought, hey, why don't we go try to find it? We thought it would be cool to say that we had been there. After searching the internet, we found fairly good directions there and headed out for the night. We had a bit of trouble locating it, but after a bit of driving around, we pulled into an area that was spot on from the descriptions we had read. We stepped out of the car, and the first thing we noticed was the mass amounts of bugs swarming us. Only a few short seconds later, we had huge dogs barking, growling, and running at us. We immediately jumped back in the car and took off. We ended up staying in the area for a little longer exploring. Later that night, back at her property, we were sitting around the fire talking. All of a sudden, we started hearing barking. It was rather startling, and she immediately froze and said she had never heard barking in this area before. She isn't one to get scared easily, so her uneasiness put me on the edge. Not too long after that, there was more barking. Very slowly, we were being surrounded by what I assumed were coyotes. We both tried yelling, jumping around and throwing rocks, but that didn't seem to do any good. I've never seen coyotes act this way. We were terrified and had no clue what to do. Not really wanting to stick around and find out if they'd get any closer to us, we doused the fire and flipped on our flashlights. She grabbed my hand and we booked it back into the trailer. We were both shaking by the time we made it in, and she locked the door. I don't think either of us slept that well. I heard a lot of weird sounds and felt the sense of dread the entire night. As soon as the sun started to rise, we decided to pack up and get out of there. We needed a car, and what we saw sent chills down my spine. On the driver's side car window was a huge handprint made with mud. It was easily twice the size of our hands. We looked at each other and silently agreed that we need to get the hell out of there. I'm not saying it was a skinwalker, but neither of us have been able to explain it, and I've never been back. Some background. I live in a rural county in Texas. I live in a rural suburb about 1.5 miles away from my grandparents, who live on an expansive longhorn cattle ranch. My grandparents are currently on a trip to Michigan, and they needed someone to watch their house, take care of their diabetic dog, and water the garden for a while. I love being alone and in the country, and I wouldn't be that far from my mom and stepdad, so I agreed to do it for them. The first 2 days were fine. It was on the third day that this began. It was about 8:30 at night. I had just made myself dinner, a Lunchable, and was ready to sit down in the living room and watch TV for a couple of hours until I went to bed. The recliner I was sat in at my grandparents' living room was directly beside their large glass doors, and I could see into their backyard and into their ranch from my seat. Just past the fence of the backyard were about a dozen deer, which wasn't odd considering there's an insane amount of deer where I live. I watched them for a second, when all of a sudden I felt a wave of fear rush over me. It was like my brain stopped seeing the deer as something harmless, and instead, they became a very imposing sight. I scanned over the deer, and my eyes landed on one in particular. I noticed it, because even though it was a doe, it was a good bit taller than the others, and seemed to be oddly bulky and slightly misshapen. I watched it for about a second before, out of nowhere, its head shot up from the grass, and it stared directly at me. I hadn't been moving, and both my dogs were inside with me asleep, but I knew that it was focusing in on me. We stared for about a second before it started to whip its head around in a really unnatural motion. The closest analogy I could make is when a video game glitches and the head of a character starts moving around wildly. It did this for another second before putting its head back down into the grass like nothing had happened. At this point, I knew something was very wrong, and I knew I had to get out of there. I called my mom, who was out fishing with my stepdad, and told her I was going home early because I was freaking out. I suffer from anxiety and can sometimes have panic attacks, so she understood, and I hauled ass to my car. All I grabbed was my phone, my Lunchables, and an Eeyore blanket that I had brought from my house. I don't really know why I grabbed the extra 2 things besides my phone, but I wasn't really thinking clearly. I'm usually a very careful driver, especially on my grandparents' shoddy gravel driveway, but I knew I had to get off their property or else I would be in real danger. My car is shitty, with the driver's side window permanently down. The entire time I drove up their half-mile-long driveway, I heard a sound coming just off from behind my car. It sounded like if a mammal tried to replicate the sound of a cicada. Very throaty and unnatural, and it was the same, constant distance from my car the entire drive off the property. Right in front of the gate before going back out onto the road were a few of my grandparents' cows. I laid eyes on a black figure amongst them, and almost like an optical illusion, it changed to be a full front profile on a longhorn. I wouldn't have thought this with my eyes playing tricks on me, because I was in a panic. If it wasn't for the horns. When I saw the quote-unquote cow, it was a black figure with no horns, but within a second I spotted it. It suddenly had 2 giant horns on either side of its head. I managed to drive home, but I still felt extremely unsafe. My instincts were telling me that if I went inside, I'd be cornering myself. At this point, I was sitting in my driveway, near hysterics, and on the phone with one of my friends, who I'll call Hope. Hope is extremely knowledgeable with this kind of stuff, and a true believer in the supernatural, and I knew she would be the only person who wouldn't think I was losing my mind. She talked to me and calmed me down, and I explained the deer to her, and she got pretty freaked out and told me she knew what it probably was. I told her that I didn't want to know because I already had an idea as to what it might be, and her confirmation would only freak me out more. At this point, I made up my mind to go to my closest neighbor's house. I knew if I stayed alone, I would be putting myself in danger. So cue me crying and clutching an Eeyore blanket as I stroll up to my neighbor's backyard, weeping and apologizing profusely. Thankfully, my neighbors are saints, and they took me inside and calmed me down. They stayed up with me for a good hour until my mom and stepdad got home from the lake, and I felt safe enough to go home. Because I had finally fully calmed down, I decided to go back to the ranch with my mom to clean up the mess I had left when I booked it out of there. But by the time we were there, even remotely close to the ranch, I felt the panic return. We got halfway down the driveway before I told my mom I couldn't do it and I had to go back. My mom was still planning to go back after she dropped me off at home, but I knew she'd be in danger if she went back alone. So I told her about the deer, and I told her I really don't want her to go back there that night, and she agreed. Hope has an older sister who is extremely well versed in the supernatural, and when she informed her of my experience, her advice was for me to never go back. This wasn't entirely realistic to me, since they are my grandparents, and I did leave most of my stuff there. But I tried to take her warning as seriously as possible, and decided to greatly limit my time there and not to go back alone until my grandparents returned. The next day, which is today, at about noon, I had to go back to gather my stuff and check on my grandparents' diabetic dog, and let the bigger outside dog in, so he would be safe from the heat. The feeling of the place was still tense and strange, but not terrifying. Later, at about 8, I had to go back again, this time to feed the dog, let the other one out, and water the plants. I was way more hesitant about it, but my mom forced me to go. I was keeping my cool pretty well, until, as we were going down the driveway, I saw a deer standing in the road. I immediately felt the fear of the previous night, and started freaking out. telling my mom that I couldn't do it and that she had to turn around. As I was freaking out with my mom distracted, trying to calm me down, this fucking deer arched its back, like when a cat stretches. That tipped me over the edge into full hysterics, but my mom still refused to take me home. My mom went inside my grandparents' house and I stayed in the truck, and called Hope again. I told her what I saw and she tried to calm me down, but nothing really worked. As I was freaking out on the phone, I saw a black shadow dart into and then out of the rearview mirror. That was it. I called my mom and was screaming for her to come back inside and take me home. Even during normal panic attacks, it never reaches this point, and my mom was screaming so harshly at my vocal cords hurt. She tried to convince me to come inside, and eventually she decided to take me home, and I was hyperventilating and sobbing until the moment I arrived back. At this point, I'm terrified and I don't know what to do. I've never experienced anything like this before, and although I hope this is going to be an isolated sense of occurrences, I can't be for sure. For now, I'm going to try to stay away from my grandparents' ranch, but that really isn't realistic. I could use any advice you're willing to give. It was around 10 at night, off a little ways from Ocean City, Maryland. It was Mother, her friend, and my sister and I. We were driving home from our vacation, and I asked if we could take the back roads. I always loved seeing the woods at night, and it was the scenic route. We were driving down, and although I was the one who asked for the trees, I was ironically on my phone texting and listening to music. We eventually came to a stretch of road that I didn't pay much attention to. It was boring, but I occasionally looked up every now and then as I did the entire ride. It was a straight path forward with nothing but streetlights, so we were driving and driving. As we crossed under the lights, it was almost relaxing. I went into a half-sleep trance. Then I suddenly woke up, and everything was fine. More lights as we drove by. No one was talking. My mom's boyfriend wasn't asleep, but there were no muffled conversations. Everything seemed calm. But I had this sudden awareness we were in the middle of the woods. It was dark and around 11:30 or 12. Without streetlights, you couldn't see anything but the stars. I immediately felt very paranoid. I turned my phone on and listened to the music. Then, we entered back to another stretch of light and drove on, and I started to feel a little bit better. This part is strange, because it was as if something told me to go to my phone, as if there was a notification. I checked and there was nothing there, and then I noticed something in my obscured vision. There were about 4 lights up ahead that were turned off, in an area where the road kind of turns. It was a fairly wooded area, and you couldn't see much without the light, so we slowed down. I didn't pay much attention to it, but this next part sticks with me. As we slowly approached the next light that was on, something crawled out from the woods and into the light. I looked up and thought it was a deer at first, but it kept moving out. It was limping, but when it fully emerged, what I saw was truly bone-chilling. A naked, ash-white skinny man crawled out on all 4s. It stopped, and as I saw it, it turned its head at us. Its eyes were deep charcoal black. We sped up fast and started driving. It wasn't human. As we drove past it, it jumped over our car weightlessly, defying physics. My mom's Mercedes had 2 sunroofs, and although it was a blur, I got a close look at it. As it passed over the car, it landed behind us and faded into the black. The scary part was, when it jumped over our car, our sunroof was open. My name is Carlos. I am now currently 14 years old. This sighting happened while I was backpacking in rural Arkansas, high in the mountains. Me and my friends, which for confidential reasons, I won't say their names, but let's call them Jerome, John, Caleb, and my crush, who I will call Laura, went backpacking with my fellow church youth. On the very first day backpacking, I noticed how quiet it was. I mean, like the forest was empty, kinda. It was just silent. But I ignored it and put it off, as maybe it was just very quiet here. But being a country boy, I should have known better. After long and tiring 5 hours of walking, we finally decided to stop and rest for the night. I will explain how the surrounding area looked like, because it is important. We were separated into two groups, guys and girls. Us guys, we slept in a clearing near a massive hill, while the girls slept under a ridge of a cliff, and on the right of both camps was a river. Also in between the camps was a ravine. Us guys, being young and stupid, decided to explore before it was too dark. We ended up finding this cave around 30 feet away from our camp. After exploring the cave, which was empty, we decided to go eat dinner. For some reason, we didn't make a fire. After eating, our counselor told us that we needed to have a buddy system when we used the bathrooms because it was hunting season. After the meeting, we went to bed. That night, I woke up with a strong urge to pee. Being the good friend I am, I didn't wake up any of my sleeping friends as I climbed up that massive hill to pee behind a tree near the top. Now, I know that was dumb, but hey, you'd rather go pee in a ravine. Now, what sounds better? As I was going up, I heard a branch break, but I brushed it off as some kind of nocturnal animal during mid-pee. I heard a low growl. It was like a guttural growl. I was in mid-pee. I couldn't stop. As soon as I finished peeing, I raced down the hill and made the mistake of turning around. I saw a massive, easily 6 foot tall, very pale humanoid-looking creature with huge black eyes which were fixated on me. I immediately ran to my tent and passed out from fright. The next morning as we were leaving, I saw in that cave a pale-looking face peering out at me. My friends didn't believe me, but one of my friends came up to me and told me that he saw it because he takes medication for his depression and he thought he was hallucinating. A few months back, I was on a routine third shift. I work as a police officer in a very small town in Ohio. It is currently the middle of fall. I'm not going to say where. People can find it pretty easily. Anyway, I was on night patrol, driving in my patrol car. Most nights, we are required to get out of our cruisers to check areas our cruisers can't fit. There is a super long, almost 2-mile bike path we are supposed to walk down. Well, one night as usual, I got out and walked the path. Usually, we do this to make sure no one is hurt or overdosed. My flashlight was dimmed during the walk, since I forgot to put it on the charger earlier that day. About 1 mile into the walk, I start to feel very strange. Not a typical gut feeling. A feeling that you know something is wrong, or something is about to go wrong. I began to hear leaves crunching. Turning in every direction, the leaves would break. My light is so dim it is hard to see much of anything. I continue trying to get this walk over. I start to speed up. In doing so, I must have triggered something's instinct. Every time I sped up, the breaking of leaves would get louder and continue with my pace. I get to the point where I know something is there, so I just stop and listen. I waited for 5 minutes, hoping to catch some kids playing a prank or a fellow officer trying to get a laugh. But nothing. The sounds have stopped. I began shining my light all around me, slowly turning my light from the tree to tree. Then I noticed something odd. I passed by it the first time. I shined my light back in the direction I noticed from earlier. I can see something, but at the time, it was hard to make out. The only difference I noticed was the contrast in colors. Old gray and black with red and orange leaves in a brown tree. I shined my light up from it. Then, 2 huge glowing eyes. Nothing like I have ever seen before. I have seen deer, wolves, and other animal eyes that reflect light, but nothing like this. I hesitated, almost drawing my firearm. But I stopped myself, knowing that I could get myself in trouble if it was a prankster. This thing took one step out from behind the tree. I got a whole body view. It was covered in feathers, extremely tall, and didn't appear to be completely human. I noticed it had hands like a human, but it having feathers that looked almost forced into the skin. I start to back up. Thankfully, it never moved more than when it did earlier. I was frozen in fear, too scared to move. But I snapped out of it when dispatch radioed. "Police 1, check up." The sounds of the radio snapped me out of my trance. I started walking backwards very quickly, not taking my eyes off this thing one time. It felt like forever, but I finally got back out of those woods. My cruiser was in the clearing. I bolted as fast as I could to it, not looking back until I got back in. I looked into the wood line from where I came in. Then I could see this thing's whole body, head shaped like a demonic owl. Head laying tilt, just staring with its huge eyes. Its body, covered in some parts by feather, other by skin that appeared to be falling off, like it was rotting. Then a terrible odor came through, so powerful it is engraved into my memory. I unlocked my cruiser, crawled in and locked my doors. I attempted to shine my spotlight and brights at it, but it ran back into the woods, letting out a scream that was like no other. I could feel the creatures below rattle my insides, leaving me almost sick to my stomach. After it ran, I drove back up to my station, sitting inside to recap what had just happened. I asked my fellow officers about it sometime later, but got very odd responses. I was being told to never look where the noises came from. It would be better if I just ignored them altogether. I was confused at this point, wondering if they had seen it themselves, but I was never given a definitive answer, just told to keep my light charged and my eyes forward. I've always loved the outdoors. History, mystery, adventure, and exploring. Where I live is the Annapolis Valley in Nova Scotia, an area steeping in long history. For the last 15 years, I've been learning about various undiscovered locations of interest. My personal focus being caves, chasms, and similar geological structures. I've spent hundreds of hours in the woods, both deep and shallow, hiked about 1,500 kilometers in search of such things, and in the end, I am successful for the most part. Around 2010, I read a spot in a book about two men finding a cave and artifacts along a river named Bloody Creek near Bridgetown. And after having read over the details of their find in the area, I took it upon myself to hunt this point of interest down, bag it and tag it. So, I let the proper people know, and I set off. I grabbed my dollar store flashlight in case I was out after dark, a bottle of Pepsi, and my walking pole, hopped into my car, and drove along to where Bloody Creek passed under the highway. I parked and got out and started searching for what I might be some incredibly old relics of old local native or French origins, and thus began the first steps into a new world. I explored along the river, climbing down the embankment to river's side, through the trees and past a bunch of animal bones. I was going from the highway's edge and following the river to the south, checking behind any clumps of trees, rocks, and anywhere a cave might be found. Before I knew it, it started to get dark. So I started back towards my car, intending on just walking beside the creek, which was 20 feet wide, but shallow. Walking back, it became dark, and before I was halfway back, I started hearing splashes and something stepping on the rocks and scuttling off, as well as what sounded like a frog and a bird had kids. A croaky chirp. I figured it was raccoons or weasels or other critters coming out for nighttime activities, and kept on walking along, until the sounds of little feet and the bird-frog sound became too distant and close behind me. So I turned around, imagining some cute animal being curious. But since the flashlight was crap, all I seen were about a set of 5 eyes that reflected blue, white, and black, spaced wide apart and blinking over the edge of the rock. At first, I thought rabbits. I went to look closer, and whatever they were ran off into the dark. I went back to my car, kind of freaked out, because I needed a new flashlight for the next time I was going out there in a better parking spot. A few days later, about mid-September, I decided to go back looking again, a bit better with a high-powered spotlight, headlamp, and a hatchet for the branches in my way. Since I had better light, I had the idea in my head that I would go after with my wife when she got back from work. I had looked at maps and seen there was a road that ran closer to the spot that I wanted to be, so I could cut out a portion of the walk that wasn't much of interest and had animal bones and trees blocking the way. The new spot was just east of the creek, alongside a road that led to a gravel pit, and I had to walk along a dirt trail for a short distance before cutting through the tree line, past a pile of apples used to bait deer down a small hill strewn with rocks and tree debris, and back beside the creek, not far from where I turned around the last time. This time I searched the riversides right up to the gravel pit before turning around as the darkness had fallen an hour before. The sound returned. I kept my lights low, intending on seeing what animal was following me, as I heard rabid animals follow people. Whatever it was seemed to have become bold as I started walking towards the small hill to walk up past the apple pile to the trail, even leaving the side of the river where safety was. Something did not feel right. The pieces started coming together. Up until this time, let me tell you, I was an absolute skeptic and told anyone who mentioned Bigfoots and UFOs that they were a fucking idiot and should get checked, maybe even a lobotomy and neutered so they didn't pass on the stupid. I was an absolute skeptic prick. The pieces came together in such fashion. The croak chirps were exposed like words, like someone saying words but just in that weird sound. The footsteps sound that like they were bipedal. The eyes were too round and far apart for any animal I know of, and besides, the light reflected didn't look normal. The final piece went into place when I turned around and let my full lights hit the area at the hill's bottom. These people were sneaking up behind me using rocks and tree debris as cover, but they were in full view now. Standing roughly 12 to 18 inches high, their skin was a dark brown, like rich wood. Their arms and legs were thin and long, attached to a shorter athletic-looking body, but the heads were rounded and looked oversized for their bodies. The eyes were high up on the face and wide apart. The noses looked like chimpanzee noses, those slits, sort of, and the mouth was wide as the head, with thick, rubbery-looking lips. They all had a gray, brown-colored hair that was shorter on the top of the head and grew into what looked like a cloak. But, looking closer, it was a longer hair that grew all the way down the back, attached to the back of the thighs and the back of the upper arms. After jacking the little bastards and getting a good look, I heard a snap of a twig behind me and turned to see another one on the hill, about 5 feet away, with a stick in its hands. It ran to hide behind a large tree. The others that were now behind me started walking and skittering towards me, making those sounds again. so I turned around again and watched them hide this time. Their coloration was almost perfect camouflage as they ducked and hid beside the trees and stones, and realizing just what I'd stepped into, my blood ran cold. The apples were piled too close to a road to be a bait for a pile of deer. The small animal bones from roadkill around the small clumps of pine trees, the larger bones like deer jammed into rocks in random places, the little paths beside bones. I had wandered into their feeding ground. Those apples were a food gift, I would later learn, and I somehow knew if I had tripped those little things, they would have swarmed all over me, popped my eyes out, and probably killed me with those sticks. They kept getting closer to me as I ascended the small hill, and when the sounds turned into shrill squeals of hate, I knew even at 200 pounds and 6 feet tall these things would eat me alive. The fear hit me like a wave, and I ran as fast as I could, got in my car, and floored it out of there. On my way home, it finally hit me that I was wrong. Creatures exist, and for some reason, they are kept from the mainstream. My world had changed forever, and I am no longer a skeptic. But I just have no idea what those things could have been.
I'm 28 now, but I was 8 or 9 at the time that it was late spring. I lived at 145 Conwy Avenue, Sault Ste. Marie, Ontario, just opposite of Marie, Michigan. My mum had just put me into bed around 9 PM and opened my window to cool off my room. I laid awake for the next few hours, tossing and turning. I was restless and felt uneasy. I opened my eyes to get up for a drink, but to my surprise I saw a tall man in scraggly clothes pacing back and forth by my bed looking down at me. It was dark, but I could tell it was in the shape of a man. I pulled my blankets up to my nose and I was terrified. I was frozen, unable to make a sound and barely able to move. Just moving my blanket felt like I was lifting a sheet of wet cement. As he or it continued to pace, I could hear popping and crackling sounds, unlike anything I had ever heard before up to this point in my life. Suddenly, the eyes seemed to gain eye shine like a wild animal, and the legs began to bend and he grew tall, almost hitting its head on my ceiling. The face of this thing also began to distort. If you've seen the movie Howl, that's how the legs looked. And if you've seen the movie Howling, the face began to look like the creepy dude with the fur coat at the colony. As this thing continued to shapeshift, I began to cry. And as I began to yell, it started to reach out towards me. This stirred my mother, who woke up and began to get up and come to my room. The creature stopped reaching for me and looked over its shoulder sneering. Then it quickly made its way to the window. It looked back at me, still transforming, and flashed me a toothy grin. Then it jumped through the window out into my yard. My mother, thank goodness, came into my room and asked me what was wrong. As I frantically tried to explain what I saw, she chalked it up to too much sugar before bed, even though she even stepped in the wet footprints left by the thing. She just figured the light rain must have picked up and come in the window. She didn't even bother to turn on the lights to see if it was footprints. She picked me up, and as I looked over her shoulder, I saw the thing. It fully changed outside in the yard. It now looked like the werewolves in the movie Dog Soldiers, which hadn't even been made at the time, but there it was, just staring back at me. like it knew it could just still get me if it wanted to. I yelled and told my mum to look, but before she could see it, it had ran off round the large 8-foot tall fence in our yard into the brush between my house and my neighbour's. She walked over and closed the window. She told me that monsters aren't real, but I knew differently. Since this time, I began to ask my father about First Nation legends and began looking into other belief systems that had shape-shifting lycanthropes. I'm now 28 and have researched a lot about werewolves, skinwalkers, berserkers, lepguru and jaguar men, and all things of this nature. I've even begun looking into how to become one, like wearing a wolfskin belt or drinking from the paw print of a wolf on a full moon. I now have a bear and a wolf claw necklace, a wolf pelt I wear on occasion, full moons, and I've been trying to get an audience with my father's friend who is a chief up near Webcule, First Nation reserves in the James Bay lowlands. But my father says he won't speak of such things, as he says talking about them draws him to you and puts you and your family in danger.
When I was about 12, my dad decided to go to Holland with my grandmother and other family members. My mother and 2 siblings and I stayed home. I'm the middle child, but am the oldest boy. With my dad being gone, I had to do the chores. It was winter, and I live on a farm, so I had to tend to the animals. Since it gets cold in the night, the animal water freezes. We raised 2 beef each year for meat. I got up at 4, as I had to do the whole time my father was gone, because I had school. I got dressed and headed outside. This was my 5th day or so of doing this. It was still dark out. There was a clear sky allowing me to see the moon and stars through the trees. I could see me breathe as I walked to the barn. I noticed that it was unusually quiet. Normally, the cows moo at me when they hear or see me. I walked into the barn and fed them their grain and alfalfa hay. I went over and broke the ice in their water trough. I fed the 3 cats we had at the time. Only one is around today. I then went around the back of our barn to look at the moon. The sky was just starting to show signs of approaching morning. All of a sudden, the cows flew out of the barn and ran straight through the damn fence. They continued running into the pasture along the creek. I then saw this 6 to 7 foot tall creature run the same direction but along the creek in the opposite direction. It made its way into the woods in a matter of seconds. Once it was in the woods, I could kind of smell a nasty smell, but maybe it was just the cows or something. I mean, I was right behind the barn. One thing that is crazy about it is that it was almost completely silent. The only time it made noise is when it stepped into the puddles along the creek. I began walking back to the house when I realized there was something in the barn. I slowly snuck over. I looked through the crack in the door, and I couldn't believe my eyes. This thing was eating the corn out of the cow's grain. One by one, every grain of it. He then looked towards the door and stood up. He looked around. He then grabbed a brick my dad uses to hold the tarp down over our grain, because our barn leaks, and threw it towards the door where I was at. I jumped and started to shake. I was in such disbelief that I actually hit myself in the head, hoping I was hallucinating. I could feel the adrenaline in me rushing like crazy. I decided to peek again. I looked through the crack, but everything was dark. I soon realized that I was looking at this ugly bitch in the face. I scooped gravel off the ground and flung it in the crack and ran. I turned and looked at the barn. This thing jumped out the window on the side and ran towards me. It jumped the fence and was gaining fast. I ran to the house and the damn door was locked. I ran to the garage and it was open. I managed to get in, and I waited there for about 5 minutes. I slowly opened the door to peek. Our garage was separate from our house, so I had to do a big 10-stride run to the back door. I sprinted and made it inside, thanking God that the door was unlocked. I looked out the window and turned the garage light on. I about died when I realized it was only 10 feet away. I didn't tell anyone because I didn't think they would believe me. I've only told my sister, and the only reason I told her was because within the last year she started going in the woods. She has found footprints. She has also had glimpses of them. I never let her go alone anymore. Whatever I saw, I'm sure is a Bigfoot. If the natives have any cave carvings and paintings of them, including many legends, then why can't they exist? I don't believe, I know. We find in the same paintings the saber-toothed tiger and the woolly mammoth.
My story starts as me and my cousin were home alone on a warm summer's day. She and I were sitting on the living room floor, sewing, as that was the only interesting thing we could do that day. We had a fan in the opened window, as it gets really hot in Mount Shasta during the summer. The fan was blowing cool air into the overheated house. I could remember that it was not a windy day whatsoever. Remember this detail, because it is very important throughout the story. Me and my cousin were just sitting there having a conversation about something that I can't specifically remember, when all of a sudden the fan falls out of the window. It was one of those box-like fans that if I think about it now, even if it was wind, I don't think it would have been strong enough to knock it over. Me and my cousin did think it was a wind at first, so we put the fan back up and continued sewing. Not that long after, I heard a crash, and looked up to see the fan had fallen over by itself again. Once again, we chalked it up to the wind and put it back up. But then it happened again. Then again. We started getting a little skeptical and went to see if it was the wind, but there was no wind or nothing. It was a nice, really hot summer's day. Right after that, all of a sudden, all the doors inside the house started opening and closing constantly. We knew for a fact that this was not the wind, as even the doors on the outside of the house were opening, like the bedroom doors, the laundry room door, the front door, and the garage door, etc. We got a little spooked out, so my cousin ended up calling her ex-boyfriend's mum, who according to my cousin was a spiritual person who knew about this kind of stuff. This lady ended up answering the phone, and we quickly explained to her what was happening. She told us that we had to go find a Bible. I obediently went into my grandparents' room because I knew they had a few different Bibles in their closet. Once we got the Bible, the lady on the phone told us that we had to open it to a random page, then join hands. We joined hands, then the lady told us to repeat after her. She then started saying some type of prayer that I never heard before. We did as she asked and repeated the prayer. The doors started opening and closing faster and more violently as we kept saying the prayer. Then all of a sudden, the strangest thing ended up happening. The second we said the final word of the prayer, everything just stopped. Got quiet. Everything went back to normal. This event has impacted me in quite a few different ways. I started becoming way more interested in all things paranormal and supernatural. I researched and found out all the information I could on all things paranormal. From all the research I have done, I have concluded that what was in that house was something called a poltergeist. A poltergeist is a type of ghost that is able to move or throw things and is also capable of making really loud noises. This is the only type of ghost I could figure out that can move all those doors. I have since been back to that house, but also with equipment I have rather made or purchased online. I have also experienced other things from doing this type of stuff. I think this experience will impact my life forever.
My name is Matthew, and I'm a hardcore biker. I own a GSXR motorcycle, a pretty fast bike in case you didn't know. I live in Grand Lagoon, Trinidad. Today was my second cousin's birthday, and my other cousins and I kept a little get-together for him. My encounter started when I left my home around midnight to get some snacks as the ones we had gotten before had been dissipated. The closest mini-mart was located out of town, about 2.5 hour drive under the speed limit. But being a biker, I loved speed. As I was about half a mile outside of town, driving on about 100 miles per hour, I accidentally hit the kill switch on the bike and it came off. I cautiously pulled over to the side of the road and hopped off. I then laughed at myself for making such a rookie mistake. It took me a few minutes after laughing at myself to realize something really odd. The entire area was completely quiet. Not just any kind of quiet. The type of quiet that makes a ringing sound in your ear. I stood there looking around, contributing to the surrounding quietness. But it was everywhere. Nothing was out tonight. Usually, you hear common bugs, like crickets and so on. But there was nothing. Memory soon kicked in, as I remembered overhearing my dad and his friend's conversation on hunting. His friend said, "Always remember when out there, if the woods get quiet, be cautious. It means there's a predator around." I quickly got quiet, and paced myself and walked back to the bike feeling rather threatened. But there was nothing here. I hopped on my bike and turned the key, watching my dashboard light up, and that's when I heard it. I heard the sound of heavy footsteps on the road in front of me. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up as chills ran down my spine, signaling for me to get out of there. I stood there paralyzed with fear as my body denied the signals from my brain, and at that moment came a low growl. I stood there, overthinking what to do, as it growled once more. I quickly snapped out of it, and pushed the start button on the bike and turned the headlights on. That was the biggest mistake of my life, because the sight that presented itself to me could never be unseen. 15 feet in front of me stood this thing. I'm saying thing, because I've never seen anything like it before. Nothing on this earth resembles this, and I would consider myself an Animal Planet freak. It stood on its hind legs, about 7 feet tall with pale white skin and yellowish eyes. And at first, I thought it could have been a bear, but there are no bears where I'm from. Its arms and legs were elongated and weird looking. It looked as if it were wearing an old tattered black fur coat. It was hunched over in the middle of the road looking right at me. It stared at me as if it saw a human for the first time. "What are you?" I asked, with a frightened voice. It stared at me for a few more minutes and then said, "What are you?" in the same exact context and sound. My heart dropped as this thing took a step towards me. At this point, I was too scared to think of anything. This thing literally just repeated what I said in my own voice. I quickly kicked the bike into first gear, turned the bike back towards the road, and started riding. As I revved the throttle, it let out a blood-curdling, ear-piercing scream as I rode off. I caught myself watching back ever so often, making sure I wasn't being pursued. I made it home safe that night. But now, I never go out after midnight. Especially not on that road. If any of you have any idea what this could have been, please let me know.